Welcome to this story about one of the most scary cases ever recorded in United States history. Before we start, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching this from and the exact time you are listening to this story. We want to know which places these true stories reach and what time of day or night you hear them. In the fall of 1843, the valleys and hills of northern Alabama still held secrets that white settlers had not told. The rough land of the Cumberland Plateau, with its thick forests and steep valleys, had become both a safe place and a prison for one man. His name would be whispered with fear and respect. This is the story of Samuel Green, a man who escaped slavery only to become something far more scary than his former owners could have imagined. The first written mention of Samuel Green appears in the records of the Johnson Plantation. It was located about 20 miles northeast of Huntsville in the Tennessee Valley District. William Johnson was a wealthy landowner who had moved from Georgia to Alabama in the 1820s. He owned more than 40 enslaved people, including a young man described simply as Sam, age 22, field hand. According to plantation records kept in the Madison County Historical Society files, Sam was noted as troublesome and had tried to escape twice before his 23rd birthday. The Johnson plantation sat in the shadow of the southern hills of the Cumberland Plateau, where the land rose sharply from the fertile valley. The mountains to the east stood like guards. Their forested slopes offered both danger and possibility. For someone thinking about escaping from slavery, these wilderness highlands represented perhaps the only real route. North was Tennessee with its own plantation system, west was the dangerous Tennessee River, and south was deeper into Alabama's plantation heartland. It was on the night of October 11th, 1843, during an unusually cold autumn storm, that Sam Green disappeared from the Johnson plantation for the third and final time. Unlike his earlier attempts, this escape showed careful planning. The Overseer's Journal, now kept in the Alabama Department of Archives and History, noted that Green had taken a wool blanket, a knife used for cutting up pigs, and about 2 weeks of dried food from the smokehouse. What makes Green's escape amazing was not just that he successfully ran away, but that he chose not to continue north toward the Free States, as most runaways did. Instead, historical evidence suggests he moved deeper into the mountainous wilderness of northeastern Alabama, into the rough land where few white settlers went. The first hint of Green's change came 3 months after he disappeared. In January of 1844, a hunter named Elijah Thornton reported to the sheriff of Jackson County that he had met a black man who looked wild while tracking deer near what is now called Guntersville Lake. According to Thornton's story kept in county records, the man was dressed in animal skins and carried a rough spear and knife. The meeting ended with the man disappearing into the bushes before Thornton could get close or speak to him. Over the next several months, similar reports came in from trappers, hunters, and the few settlers brave enough to build homes in the more distant valleys of the area. The figure was always described the same way: a tall black man with a clear scar across his left cheek, matching Samuel Green's written physical description, dressed in animal hides and showing remarkable skills in the woods. What began as curious sightings, however, soon took a more scary turn. In April of 1844, a small hunting party led by Thomas Wilkes failed to return to their settlement near present-day Scottsboro. When a search party found their camp, they discovered it destroyed with signs of violence and 3 of the 4 men missing. The lone survivor, James Carter, was discovered hiding in a hollow tree nearly a mile away in a state of extreme fear. Carter's story, recorded by the county judge, describes an attack by a black mountain devil who moved like a ghost through the trees and who killed his companions with terrible speed. While authorities first dismissed Carter's story as the mad words of a man driven crazy by some more ordinary tragedy, later events would make his claims believable. Throughout the summer and fall of 1844, isolated homes in the area began reporting thefts, not of valuable items, but of useful things: tools, weapons, cooking items, and clothing. More disturbing were the reports that these thefts happened while the cabin's people slept, with the intruder somehow entering and leaving without waking them. By December of that year, the figure had gotten a name among the local people: the Mountain Devil. Rumors spread through settlements that this was no ordinary runaway, but a man with supernatural abilities who could move silently through the night, survive the harshest conditions, and who held a particular hatred for white hunters and slave catchers. Newspaper stories from the Huntsville Democrat now kept on microfilm in the state files, dismiss these stories as superstitious nonsense, though they admit that some black runaway appears to be living as a savage in the highlands to the northeast of our city. Mountain Devil might have remained a local curiosity had it not been for the events of February 18, 1845. Slave-catching party led by Jeremiah Burke, a well-known figure who had made his reputation catching runaways throughout the South, went into the mountains with the specific goal of capturing the hard-to-find figure. Burke had been hired by several plantation owners worried that Green's continued freedom might inspire others to try to escape. Burke's party had 6 men and 4 tracking dogs. According to the only survivor's story, they followed their dogs deep into a narrow valley on the second day of their trip. As darkness fell, they made camp near a stream. Shortly before midnight, the dogs began to growl and then fell silent. What followed was described as a carefully planned slaughter. The survivor, a man named Michael Reynolds, reported that shadows moved among the trees, and the slave catchers were killed one by one, pulled into the darkness without a sound. Reynolds himself escaped only by falling into the creek and being swept downstream. He would later tell authorities that as he clung to a fallen log in the water, he saw a tall figure standing on the bank watching him. "He could have killed me with the bow he carried," Reynolds stated, but instead he watched me drift away, as if he wanted me to tell what happened. The authorities could no longer ignore the situation. The deaths of 5 white men, especially men employed in the legally approved recovery of property, demanded action. In March of 1845, Governor Benjamin Fitzpatrick authorized a militia trip into the mountain area to capture or kill the runaway, now openly identified in official letters as Samuel Green. The trip, made up of 40 armed men led by Captain William Holtz, spent 3 weeks searching the mountains. Their journals describe a frustrating chase of a ghost, finding abandoned camps still warm from recent fires, discovering storage places of stolen goods hidden in caves, and occasionally glimpsing a distant figure who would vanish before they could close in. On the 18th day of their search, the militia discovered something that would cement Green's reputation in the folklore of the area. Deep in a remote valley, they found what appeared to be Green's main camp, a well-made structure built partly into a cliff face, using a natural cave but extended with wooden walls and a thatched roof. Inside, they discovered a collection of weapons, 3 rifles with ammunition, multiple knives of different sizes, several spears, and a bow with arrows. More unsettling were the personal items of at least 7 men who had gone missing in the area over the previous year. Most disturbing of all was a journal apparently kept by Green himself. The journal, written on paper stolen from different sources and bound with animal hide, revealed a man of surprising ability to read and write and deep hatred. Green wrote of his life on the Johnson plantation, describing in detail the abuse he had suffered and seen. He wrote of his earlier escape attempts and the punishments that followed. And he wrote of his change in the wilderness. "In these mountains I have become what they feared. No longer a slave, but a demon of their own making. What mercy did they show? So shall I show the same." The journal also revealed that Green had not been alone in the wilderness. He had met and formed partnerships with at least 2 other runaways, though he never mentioned their names, calling them only brothers in bondage. Together, they had developed a system of survival in the harsh mountain environment, hunting, gathering, and stealing what they couldn't make themselves. Captain Holtz's militia spent another week searching for Green and his companions, but found no trace of them. It appeared that upon discovering the militia's presence in the mountains, Green had left his camp and moved deeper into the wilderness. The trip returned to Huntsville with the journal and other evidence, but without their target. The Mountain Devil's activities seemed to slow down after the militia trip. There were fewer reports of sightings or thefts through the rest of 1845, leading some to guess that Green had finally run north or perhaps died in the wilderness. This period of relative quiet ended dramatically in January of 1846. On the night of January 7th, William Johnson, Green's former owner, was found dead in his study. The circumstances were strange. The house had been locked from inside. No items were stolen, and Johnson's body had a single wound, a handmade arrow driven through his heart. On the desk before him lay a folded piece of paper with a message written in careful handwriting. "Justice comes even to the mighty. Remember Samuel Green." The murder of a well-known plantation owner in his own home sent shockwaves through the area. A second trip was organized, larger than the first, with over 60 armed men and several professional trackers from as far away as Tennessee. This time they were told not to take the runaway alive. The trip left on January 20th, 1846, confident that with their numbers and the winter conditions exposing more of the land, they would succeed where the first had failed. They would return 2 weeks later with their numbers reduced by 17. Survivors described a campaign of planned terror done by Greene and his allies. Using their close knowledge of the land, the runaways separated groups of militia, led them into traps, created false trails, and struck at night when seeing was hardest. One particularly scary story tells of 6 militiamen making camp in what they thought was a safe spot, only to wake up to find 2 of their companions missing and a message carved into a tree. "You hunt a man who learned to hunt from watching you." The trip's leader, Major Thomas Bradford, ordered a retreat after losing more than a quarter of his force without even confirming a sighting of Greene. In his report to Governor Fitzpatrick, he wrote, "We face not a man, but a ghost who has mastered these mountains completely. He strikes and vanishes. My men fear entering the deep valleys or thick forests, believing death waits in every shadow. I cannot in good conscience continue to risk their lives in what appears to be a useless chase." For the next year and a half, the legend of the Mountain Devil grew. While direct attacks became less frequent, Greene's presence remained a constant shadow over the area. Travelers reported finding rough warnings carved into trees along mountain paths. Slave catchers refused assignments that would take them into the highlands. Local Native Americans of the Cherokee tribe, who kept a small presence in the area despite the forced removals of the 1830s, spoke of a revenge spirit who protected those running from slavery. Perhaps most importantly, the number of successful escapes from plantations in northern Alabama increased dramatically during this time. While no direct evidence links Greene to these escapes, oral histories collected from descendants of formerly enslaved people in the area suggest that Greene and his companions operated a basic network, guiding runaways through the mountains and helping them avoid capture, the last confirmed. Sighting of Samuel Greene came in August of 1847. Surveying party working near what is now the Alabama-Georgia border met a man matching Greene's description. According to their story, he approached them openly, carrying no weapons. The party's leader, Edward Mitchell, later wrote that the man identified himself as Samuel Greene and spoke calmly with them for nearly an hour. Mitchell described Greene as weathered but not weakened by his years in the wilderness. He noted that Greene's speech was clear and that he spoke with the confidence of a free man, not the caution of a runaway. Most remarkably, Greene reportedly told the surveyors that he was preparing to leave Alabama. "I have made these mountains remember me," Mitchell quoted him as saying. "Now I go to find what freedom truly means." Whether Greene actually escaped north, as his words to Mitchell suggested, remains unknown. No further confirmed sightings or incidents blamed on him appear in historical records after 1847. However, his legend continued. Throughout the 1850s, plantation owners in northern Alabama continued to report that their enslaved workers whispered stories of the mountain devil who lived free in the wilderness and punished those who abused their power. During the Civil War, when Union forces occupied parts of northern Alabama, several officers recorded in their journals hearing tales from local residents about the Black Phantom of the mountains who had terrorized the area years earlier. One Union captain, James Woodson, wrote in 1864 that he had met an elderly Cherokee man who claimed to have sheltered Greene in the last days before he left the area. According to this story, Greene had indeed traveled north, eventually reaching Canada. The historical record provides no clear ending to Samuel Greene's story. Like many people who exist at the meeting point of documented history and folklore, the line between fact and legend has become blurred over time. What remains clear, however, is that for nearly 4 years, an escaped enslaved man not only survived in one of the most challenging wilderness environments of the American South, but changed himself from hunted to hunter. From property to phantom, from object to legend, the mountains of northern Alabama still stand. Their valleys and hills are now crossed by highways and dotted with towns. Few who travel through this scenic landscape today know the story of the man who once made these heights his fortress and hunting ground. Yet in the small communities that have existed here for generations, particularly among the descendants of enslaved people, the memory of Samuel Greene, the slave who escaped and became the most feared mountain man in the South, lives on a complex symbol of resistance, survival, and the terrible price of freedom in a land built on slavery. The final entry in Samuel Green's recovered journal perhaps best sums up his change and legacy. They made me property, but these mountains made me a man. They made me invisible, but here I learned to see in darkness. They tried to break my spirit, but instead created something they could never control. I am what they created, turned back upon its creators. Let history remember this truth. And history, however imperfectly, has. In historical stories collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, several elderly formerly enslaved people from northern Alabama spoke of Samuel Green, though they knew him by different names, the Shadow Man, Mountain Samuel, or simply the Free One. These oral histories suggest that Green's influence went far beyond the terror he caused in white authorities. To many enslaved people in the area, he represented a different kind of possibility, not just escape, but defiance and even payback. Martha Johnson, interviewed in 1937 at the age of 91, remembered stories her mother had told about Green. Mama used to whisper to us children that if the master was cruel, the mountain man would know, and he'd come down from his hiding place to set things right. We weren't supposed to talk about him, but everyone knew. When masters or overseers were found dead or disappeared, the slaves would look at each other knowingly. Nobody mourned those men. The mental impact of Green's existence, or even just the belief in his existence on the system of slavery in northern Alabama, cannot be overstated. Plantation records from 1844 through 1848 show an unusual amount of restraint in the punishment of enslaved people in areas near the mountains. One plantation owner wrote to his brother in Georgia, "We must tread carefully with discipline, for there is a devil in these hills who has appointed himself judge and executioner of those he thinks are too harsh." This fear extended to the slave patrols as well. Thomas Weatherby, who served on such a patrol in Jackson County, wrote in his memoir, published after his death in 1879, "No man wished to ride too near the highlands after dark." We had heard what happened to Burke's party. Some claimed it was Indians, or even a panther, but we knew better. There was a man in those mountains who had declared war on anyone who hunted his kind, and he fought that war with terrible skill. The winter of 1847 brought particularly harsh conditions to the mountains of northern Alabama. Temperatures dropped well below freezing for weeks at a time, and snow piled up in the higher areas. For someone living in the wilderness, even someone as skilled as Green had become, survival would have been extraordinarily challenging. It was during this winter that some believed Green finally left the area, a fascinating document, discovered in the 1890s, and now kept in the collection of the Alabama Department of Archives and History, suggests one possible fate for Samuel Green. The document is a letter dated May 1848, written by a Quaker abolitionist in Pennsylvania to a colleague in Ohio. In it, the writer mentions a remarkable man recently arrived from the southern wilderness who identified himself as Samuel and claimed to have lived as a wild man in the mountains of Alabama after escaping slavery. The letter describes this man as carrying the physical and mental scars of both slavery and his years of solitary survival, but also as having an intelligence and dignity that commands respect from all who meet him. According to the writer, Samuel planned to continue to Canada, fearing that even in a free state, the recently passed Fugitive Slave Act might result in his capture and return to the South. If this letter indeed refers to Samuel Green, it provides a rare glimpse of his life after Alabama. The writer noted that Samuel spoke of having gotten a measure of justice during his time in the wilderness, but now sought a quieter freedom among people who might understand his humanity. The letter ends with the observation that Samuel carries with him a small journal bound in leather in which he writes with surprising skill. No further documentary evidence of Green's life has been discovered. If he did reach Canada, he likely changed his name and perhaps created a new identity, as did many runaways from slavery. The trail of historical clues ends here, leaving us to wonder about the rest of his life. However, the impact of Samuel Green's 4 years as the Mountain Devil continued to echo through the area he left behind. Throughout the 1850s, as tensions increased and the nation moved toward civil war, the mountainous areas of northern Alabama kept their reputation as dangerous territory for slave catchers and patrollers. Whether this was due to Green's ongoing influence, other runaways who may have followed his example, or simply the power of his legend, The practical effect was the creation of a region where the enforcement of slavery became notably more difficult. Perhaps more importantly, Green's story became part of a hidden oral tradition among enslaved communities, passed in whispers from plantation to plantation. The tale of the man who not only escaped but turned the tables on his pursuers served as both warning and inspiration. Unlike other well-known runaways such as Frederick Douglass, who escaped to become a public abolitionist speaker and writer, Green represented a different kind of resistance, silent, violent, and uncompromising. During the Civil War, when Union forces began to occupy parts of northern Alabama in 1862, some commanders reported an unusual happening. Enslaved people running from plantations would often head not toward Union lines, but toward the mountains. Colonel James Montgomery, commanding a regiment that included formerly enslaved soldiers, wrote in his official report, "The local black people hold a curious belief that safety lies not with us, but in the high country to the east, where they claim some champion of their race once made his kingdom." This belief was so common that Union officers began sending guides into the mountains to direct these runaways toward their lines instead. One such guide, Sergeant William Jackson, formerly enslaved himself, reported conversations with those he met. "They speak of a man named Green," he wrote, "as if he were still there watching over those mountains. I tried to tell them he's long gone if he ever existed at all." But the belief runs deep. As the war went on and slavery's hold on the South weakened, the legend of Samuel Green changed. In the uncertain and often violent period of Reconstruction, stories of the Mountain Devil took on new dimensions. For the newly freed black population of northern Alabama, Green became a symbol of resistance and self-determination. For many whites, especially those who had lost power and privilege with the Confederacy's defeat, he represented their worst fears of black revenge. A story from 1871, recorded by a Freedmen's Bureau agent working in Huntsville, describes how just saying Green's name could affect a situation. A dispute between a white landowner and his black tenants grew heated, with the former making threats of violence. An elderly black man simply said, "These mountains still have eyes just as they did in Green's time." The landowner reportedly turned pale and withdrew his threats immediately. Historian Claudia Mitchell Kernan, who has studied the folklore of the area extensively, notes that by the late 19th century, the Samuel Green story had developed different versions depending on who was telling it. In white communities, she writes, Green was shown as almost supernatural, an evil spirit who attacked without reason. In black communities, he was a justice bringer, someone who punished only those who deserved punishment and who helped others escape slavery. These different stories reflect the complex legacy of a man who, whether by choice or necessity, used violence as a tool against oppression. The historical Samuel Green, as far as he can be separated from the legend, was neither demon nor saint, but a man formed by the brutal system he escaped and the harsh wilderness that became his refuge. His actions, while certainly vengeful, were not random. No records exist of Green attacking women or children, and even some white men, like the surveyor Edward Mitchell, reported peaceful meetings with him. Archaeological investigations in the 1990s brought a new dimension to the Green story. A team from the University of Alabama investigating prehistoric Native American sites in the Cumberland Plateau area discovered the remains of a small cabin built into a protected rock overhang. Carbon dating of charcoal from the fire pit suggested use in the mid-19th century, and items recovered included handmade tools, modified weapons, and most interestingly, a metal button matching those used on clothing at the Johnson plantation during the 1840s. While it cannot be proven for sure that this was one of Green's hideouts, the location and timing match historical stories. Dr. Margaret Wilkinson, who led the dig, noted in her report that the cleverness displayed in this dwelling's construction speaks to someone with remarkable adaptability and knowledge of wilderness survival skills. The site also had a view of one of the few trails leading into that section of the mountains, suggesting its occupant was concerned with seeing who approached. By the early 20th century, the story of Samuel Green had begun to fade from public memory, kept mostly in family histories and local stories. The rapid industrialization of parts of northern Alabama, particularly around Birmingham, brought new populations to the area with no connection to its pre-Civil War past. The mountains that had once been Green's domain were increasingly cut through by mining operations, logging trails, and eventually paved roads. Yet in some communities, particularly those established by formerly enslaved people and their descendants, Green's memory continued. Church records from a small African Methodist Episcopal congregation near Scottsboro contain references to yearly gatherings held on the anniversary of William Johnson's death. January 7th, described simply as Remembrance Day. According to elderly members interviewed in the 1970s, these gatherings honored the day justice came to the wicked master, a clear reference to Green's most dramatic act of revenge. Throughout the 20th century, as the civil rights movement brought renewed attention to America's history of racial oppression and resistance, scholars began to re-examine stories like Green's that had been largely left out of official histories. The sparse documentary evidence made clear conclusions difficult, but the consistency of oral traditions across multiple communities gave credibility to the core story. An escaped enslaved man had indeed lived in these mountains and become a figure of both terror and hope. Dr. Benjamin Turner, a historian at Howard University who has studied the Underground Railroad extensively, places Green in a category he calls wilderness maroons, runaways who, rather than trying to reach the northern states, created hidden societies within the South itself. While Green appears to have operated mostly alone or with very few companions, Turner writes, his strategy is similar to that of larger maroon communities in the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia and North Carolina, or in the bayous of Louisiana. These were people who didn't just escape slavery. They created alternative spaces of black freedom deep within slave territory. In the neighboring state of Tennessee, a curious echo of the Green story came out in 1969 when an elderly woman named Sarah Jenkins gave an interview to a graduate student researching her family history. Jenkins, then 97 years old, claimed that her grandfather had been a companion to the mountain man of Alabama. According to Jenkins, her grandfather William had escaped from a plantation in Georgia around 1845 and made his way west, eventually meeting Green in the highlands. Grandpa Williams said this man, Samuel, taught him how to live in the wild. Jenkins remembered how to move without being seen, how to find food, how to make weapons from what the forest provided. They lived together for almost 2 years before Samuel decided to go north. Grandpa chose to stay in the mountains until after the war, then came down and found my grandmother. Jenkins's story, if accurate, provides a rare look into the community aspect of Green's wilderness existence. It suggests that contrary to his image as a solitary ghost, Green may have served as a teacher to other runaways, passing on the survival skills he had mastered. This lines up with the references in Green's journal to brothers in bondage and supports the theory that he played a role in helping other escapes. The full truth of Samuel Green's life and fate may never be known with certainty. Like many who lived under slavery, his existence was barely documented until his actions forced their way into the historical record. Even then, many of the stories come from those who feared or hunted him rather than from his own voice. The journal recovered from his abandoned camp remains the closest thing to a first-person story. But even that tells only part of his story. What is clear, however, is that for a brief but important period, Samuel Green achieved something remarkable. He reversed the power dynamics of his time and place. In a society built on the absolute control of black bodies by white authority, he created a space where that authority could not reach, where, in fact, those who tried to use it did so at their own risk. The mountains became his domain, a kingdom of one where he was not property, but ruler. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, interest in Green's story experienced a comeback. A regional museum in Scottsboro established a small exhibit dedicated to the legend of the Mountain Devil, displaying items from the era and maps of his suspected territory. In 2009, a historical marker was put up near the believed site of one of his camps, though the text carefully frames the story as local legend rather than confirmed history. More importantly, descendants of enslaved people from the plantations of northern Alabama have begun collecting and keeping family stories related to Green. In 2017, a reunion of families with roots in the area included a session dedicated to these oral histories. James Washington, one of the organizers, explained, "Samuel Green is part of our heritage of resistance. Whether every story about him is literally true doesn't matter as much as what he represents. The refusal to accept slavery, the determination to be free, and the courage to fight back when necessary. The mountains themselves have changed since Green's time. Where once stood unbroken forest now stands vacation homes and state parks. Trails that were once known only to wildlife and the occasional brave hunter are now marked on maps and traveled by thousands of hikers yearly. Yet in certain remote valleys, particularly in the deepest parts of the Cumberland Plateau, it remains possible to sense something of what Green must have experienced: the isolation, the challenge, and perhaps also the freedom. Park Ranger Deborah Coleman, who has worked in the area for over 2 decades, notes that she occasionally meets visitors who come specifically because of the Green legend. They want to walk where he walked, she says. Some come out of historical interest, others because they see him as a hero. A few even claim to feel his presence still in these mountains. Coleman herself is skeptical of supernatural claims, but acknowledges the power of the story. When you're deep in these valleys, especially as darkness falls, it's not hard to imagine how a man who knew this land could move like a ghost, appearing and disappearing at will. Even today, with all our technology and marked trails, people get lost up here. In Green's time, these mountains would have been the perfect fortress for someone determined to remain free. In recent years, Samuel Green's story has attracted attention from scholars of what is sometimes called Black survivalism, the strategies and skills developed by African Americans to ensure their survival in hostile environments. Dr. Monica Richardson, whose research focuses on this area, sees Green as an important case study. He didn't just survive. He mastered his environment so completely that he changed from hunted to hunter, she observes. In doing so, he showed a level of adaptability and resourcefulness that goes against the dehumanizing stereotypes used to justify slavery. The mental dimension of Green's impact has also drawn scholarly interest. Dr. Terrence Watson, a historian of slave resistance, argues that Green's greatest achievement may have been the climate of fear he created among those who enforced the slave system. By striking at slave catchers and particularly abusive masters, Watson writes, Green attacked the basic premise of slavery, that white authority was absolute and unchallengeable. Every patrol that hesitated to enter the mountains, every overseer who lessened his treatment of the enslaved for fear of revenge, represented a crack in the structure of control. For modern residents of northern Alabama, attitudes toward the Green legend tend to divide along predictable lines. Many white residents see it as a colorful but exaggerated piece of local history, while many black residents view it as an important chapter in the longer story of resistance to oppression. Some local businesses have tried to profit from the legend, with one outdoor outfitter offering Mountain Devil hiking tours of areas where Green supposedly lived, an irony that would likely not be lost on Green himself. As with many historical figures who existed at the edges of documented history, the absence of clear records has allowed Samuel Green to become whatever various groups need him to be: demon or hero, murderer or freedom fighter, cautionary tale or inspiration. Perhaps the closest to the truth lies in the words said to be from Green himself in his final meeting with Surveyor Edward Mitchell. I have become what necessity demanded. Judge me, not unless you have worn the chains I broke. The most deep legacy of Samuel Green may be the questions his story forces us to face about the nature of resistance to systematic oppression. In a society where legal help was non-existent for the enslaved, where every institution reinforced their subjugation, what forms of resistance were possible? What forms were justifiable? Green chose a path of direct, often violent opposition, a choice that few enslaved people made, but one that comes from the particular circumstances of his life and the opportunities presented by the mountainous landscape where he found refuge. Throughout American history, the main stories of resistance to slavery have tended to focus on those who escaped north and worked within legal and moral frameworks recognizable to white society, figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, or Sojourner Truth. These individuals and their approaches to resistance are rightfully celebrated. But Samuel Green represents another tradition, one less comfortable for mainstream historical memory: the tradition of the maroon, the rebel, the one who refused not just slavery, but also the terms of engagement set by the oppressor. It is perhaps fitting that Green's final fate remains uncertain. Some stories suggest he reached Canada and lived out his days in quiet freedom. Others claim he died in the mountains during that harsh winter of 1847. Still others insist he never truly left, that he remained in his wilderness domain, growing old in the valleys and hills he had come to know so closely. This uncertainty allows his story to resist closure, to remain open-ended. much like the broader American reckoning with the legacy of slavery itself. In the end, Samuel Green, the slave who escaped and became the most feared mountain man in the South, emerges as neither myth nor fully documented history, but something in between, a figure whose existence is verified by enough primary sources to be undeniable, but whose deeds and final fate remain unclear enough to fuel ongoing fascination. His story serves as a reminder that the history of American slavery and resistance contains many chapters still partly hidden, many voices still not fully heard, and many acts of defiance still not widely known. The mountains of northern Alabama stand as they have for thousands of years, silent witnesses to countless human dramas played out in their forests and valleys. Among these, the saga of Samuel Green occupies a unique place, a testament to one man's extraordinary will to be free and his change of a harsh wilderness into a weapon against those who had claimed ownership of his body and labor. Visitors to these highlands today, gazing out over the seemingly endless hills fading into the distance, might well wonder, what other stories do these mountains hold? What other acts of courage, desperation, or defiance remain known only to the ancient trees and ageless stones? And what would Samuel Green make of the world his brief but remarkable rebellion helped in some small way to create? In the words of the final passage said to be from Green's journal, "I came to these mountains a fugitive running from what I was told I must be. I leave them a man certain of who I truly am. Whatever awaits me beyond these hills, I carry this truth within me, as unmovable as the mountains themselves. I was born a slave, but I will die free in body and in spirit. Let those who come after know it can be done.